10 years ago, my life was irrevocably changed by a young woman named Katrina. Obviously, Katrina's not a person, but she is very much alive for people who 10 years ago yesterday began living with the destruction of a hurricane. Just this past week, in talking to friends and sitting alone, so many memories and emotions have literally come flooding in. Katrina might as well be a person I speak with. Some who still live there speak with Katrina every day. And sometimes those words they share with her are not quite pleasant words. 10 years ago yesterday, Katrina made landfall in Louisiana and Mississippi, delivering in her name one of the country's largest natural disasters. Some nearly 2,000 people died, though suspicion is the number is much greater than that. Beyond the physical bodies, beyond lives lost, how then do you count the destruction of jobs lost, homes destroyed, family photographs and records lost, and people now separated? Hurricanes, earthquakes, floods are but a few of the natural disasters that cause human suffering. And in the midst of human suffering, in the midst of lives lost, we declare that life continues. Some of you give birth, literally life continuing. Some of you have just witnessed your children graduating from high school, and you're now sending them off to college. For some of you, that might be cause for great celebration for your child to go off to college. I'm sure with mixed emotions, of course. For some of you looking for work, you found a new job, and that's cause for celebration. And yet, for others, you're retiring from a career, and that's cause for celebration. So in the midst of pain and suffering, we also celebrate. It's quite weird, this rhythm of life. The story of Cain and Abel, one of the early stories in our scripture, reminds us that we sadly have a primitive urge to kill others and desire what other people have. And we see this played out weekly, if not daily. Just this past week, we're reminded of this with our neighbors in Roanoke. We're also reminded of this playing out all around the world, of those, no matter religion, no matter race, no matter social class, this very fundamental story that we humans do have some capacity to inflict evil on others. And yet we have this great capacity to give life, bear life, to do good work, to love each other. It's so strange, a weird rhythm we have even within ourselves. And so in the midst of pain and suffering, we are here this morning to celebrate. We celebrate the return of the first rector. It's odd when I tell people that I'm rector number 2, and I say it, and I'm only the second one. But we celebrate Randall's return to baptize his grandchild, Adelaide, and to baptize the Fosters, Charlie. It's time for celebrating and rejoicing for new birth. So how in the world do we sit with the fact that evil does persist in spite of our best efforts to wage peace and justice? How can God, who is described in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam as good, how can God permit evil? Why are there natural disasters such as hurricanes if creation was deemed good? We've been struggling with these questions for hundreds of years, trying to reconcile this great capacity for love and goodness and truth and grace that we all can have, and then for some of us, this capacity to inflict harm on others. I want to be clear about a couple of things. The great difficulty we have with these questions is that the Bible doesn't give us the final answer. And so that makes it difficult for Christians to be able to tell the world what it really means, what are all the answers, because the Bible doesn't give it to us. I don't know why people suffer. I don't know why people are diagnosed with cancer and their neighbor is not. Though I'm not a doctor, I can tell you how cancer works. I can describe it, how cells eat on each other. Bad cells begin feeding and consuming other cells. I can describe that medically, but I can't answer the big why. I can describe hurricanes. I can tell you how they form in certain oceans with certain temperatures. Though I'm not a scientist, let me be very clear, I'm not a scientist. I can tell you how hurricanes form. But standing on a slab of concrete with a cancer patient dying within days of pancreatic cancer and trying to explain to him why his house is no longer there, I can't do that. I do want to be clear, though, that God is not one to dole out human misery and suffering to make us tough or to build character. And for God's sake, human suffering and misery is not part of God's plan. God's not some cosmic dispenser of tough times to see if the created order knows how to respond and rise above it. I do know that in the midst of suffering and misery, we also are in the midst of great celebration. And on a day that young children wear pretty white gowns, and we're here with candles lighted, we're all dressed so well, and you all look so beautiful. In the midst of all of this, here in our very baptismal service, we talk openly about evil as we declare God's grace, beauty, and love. This rhythm, this odd rhythm of suffering and rejoicing. For nearly 9 years, working in hospice, I was the administrator. I wore the suit and tie, had to manage personnel, spent all my days arguing with insurance companies and Medicare and Medicaid. I am so glad to leave those days behind. But I remember quite well that day 10 years ago, watching the floodwaters pour into New Orleans, near my home. And I unmistakably realized I was called to go there and to be with people in the midst of great suffering and need. While there in New Orleans, I happened upon St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Lakeview, totally destroyed by the flood. As I made my way there to see the destruction, I happened to notice an Episcopal relief and development truck parked very prominently outside the church. It was my first time to come across Episcopal relief and development, and there they were, giving out food to relief workers, giving out food to construction crews, giving out food to whoever was around, and obviously more important than giving out food, they were there to listen to others, to simply be there with others, to be in the midst of pain and suffering. That is what I believe we are called to do as Christians. One of my hospice patients paid me what I think is the best compliment I've ever been given. She said to me, "Tim, and being a fan of Don Quixote," that was her favorite novel, she said, "Tim, you remind me that you are slow to speak and quick to listen." That wonderful phrase we hear from the epistle. What a wonderful gift that would be to give to others. A very simple gift. Be slow to speak and quick to listen, quick to love. In the midst of that suffering and pain, in the midst of people dying, there was another reason to celebrate. Beyond Episcopal relief and development, beyond all the Episcopal churches that rallied, beyond my own bishop then that rallied to the falter of his own health, there were a group of young men who helped turn the spirits of the city. Wonderful people who did good, also known as the New Orleans Saints. Some people, particularly those of you who might not be sports fans or football fans, may say, "Oh, that's just stupid and crazy. Football games and football players can't give jobs back. They can't build houses. They can't restore hope to people." But what the saints did to a city of different people from different races, social classes, religious persuasions, peoples whose lives had been destroyed or forever altered, what they did provide is normalcy. Even if for 5 minutes a day you could have a normal conversation and not have to talk about your insurance claim and why it's not coming, or not talk about should I move and never come back, to not talk about your family that's living in another state, to not talk about the cancer you're living with, if but for 5 minutes, for some measure of normalcy, that was an incredible gift. There were over 255,000 people at least, nearly 300,000 people who left New Orleans and have never returned. I was one of the crazy people. As the 250 to 300,000 people were leaving New Orleans, I decided that's where I needed to be. Because I'm convinced, as Christian people, we who renew our baptismal covenant, we who introduce children to the faith of the church and the faith of being a Christian, we are called to weigh in, literally wade into the deep waters of a world that desperately needs some measure of hope and normalcy and new life. That is what we are called to do. So in this wonderful day that we welcome Adelaide and Charlie into the church, and we celebrate with parents and grandparents on this wonderful day, we remember, you will hear these words in just a moment. Grant, O Lord, that all who were baptized into the death of Jesus Christ, your Son, may live in the power of his resurrection. On this beautiful day, with beautiful children and beautiful people, as we celebrate, we also pray that we who were baptized into the death of Jesus may live in the power of his resurrection, in the power of new life. We are reminded of that in the Christian narrative, that instead of avoiding suffering and misery and pain, Jesus actually stepped right into the middle of it and gave himself In our very crucifixion, we are reminded that that is where life is to be found. It was not lost on me and many others that the emblem, the logo for the saints is a fleur-de-lis, which has throughout the years been a symbol of the lily. And for the church, the symbol of resurrection and new life. Ironic, long before Katrina, the logo, the message of the saints was the lily, new life, resurrection. Many of you are familiar with the writings of Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel is the most notable, arguably the most widely known speaker, commentator, writer about the Holocaust. He himself grew up in a concentration camp. And in his book called Night, he described one day seeing a child about his age arrested. Imagine this, someone arrested in a concentration camp. And this child was detained for stealing food. Wanting to make an example of him, the guards brought him in front of a group of children, adults, and they hung the young child for everyone to see. Wiesel says he remembers adults asking, "Where in the world is God? Where is God in the midst of suffering?" And then Wiesel recalls another adult speaking up, another adult pointing to the child and saying, "That is where God is. This is where God is." In the midst of suffering, in the midst of our confusion, in the midst of the everyday life that we experience. O Master, let me walk with thee in lowly paths of service free. Tell me thy secret. Help me bear the strain of toil, the fret of care. In the name of God, amen.